This is an excerpt from a presentation I did for the Minnesota Ambulance Association for their annual Teaching and Learning Conference for EMS educators, and the focus is on debriefing. And this is just a little blurb about some concepts, some things to think about, some strategies that might help us be effective in our debriefing efforts after a scenario.
So that's where debriefing comes in. And I would argue that debriefing is actually where your learning happens. The vast majority of what your students are going to learn, what they're going to retain, and what they're going to be able to apply later comes through a debriefing process and a reflection process. Students need an opportunity to process for themselves what just happened, to process what they did and why, to think about it, to talk about it, to work through it. And if we can allow students to discover that learning for themselves, rather than us telling them what they did right or wrong, they're going to retain it more effectively. And that's been proven in a number of studies, in a number of settings. We know this is the case. So we need to, as facilitators, think about our strategy and our approach and build it in a way that lets the students tell us what should have happened. Let the students tell us what they learned from this before we add in our own observations. And most of the time, students, especially in groups of students sharing information, they will get to the key points. They will figure out most of the things if you give them that opportunity. And if they don't, then obviously as the instructor, you have the opportunity to say, well, that was good, and yes, that's a good observation, but here's the other thing you need to realize, and here's what's important about that scenario and what you didn't figure out. We always have that opportunity to add it in, but you need to start with letting them discover it for themselves. So one thing that we do, and this is from Fairfax County, Virginia Commonwealth, has this scenario of self-reflection form. My friend Chris Kroboth ran their program for years and shared this with me. And this is a really simplistic form you can do. I have a copy of this in the documents that are connected to this also. But the idea is that when you get done with a scenario, you hand the students, so the scenario wraps up, they've finished running the call, and before we debrief, what I do now, I use this with all of our scenarios, I hand the students a piece of paper, usually something similar to this, and I say, go debrief. And so the team, the 2, 3, 4 students that were on the team taking care of the patient in our scenario, they go off on their own and they answer these questions. What did they do well? What could they do better? Were there things they thought they did that they missed? Were there things they didn't realize they did that they probably shouldn't have? Those kind of things. It's just some prompts to get them talking, writing, discussing. And while the students are doing that process, my role player, my instructors are resetting the scenario, putting the equipment back together, getting everything set up ready to go for the next scenario, but we let the students do their own self-reflection first. When we bring them back, I love starting with this, and rather than say, what did you do right? And a lot of people do this. They do the, tell me, finish with something, start with something good, get to the meat of what they did wrong, finish with a positive, start positive, end positive, all of that. That's okay, but it really has been shown to be not as effective as people think. The rather crass way to describe that is it's kind of a shit sandwich. You get, it doesn't matter how sweet the bread is on either side. If what's in the middle is really, really bad, then people are going to walk away with a bad taste in their mouth, and that's what they're going to remember. That's what they're going to focus on. So we need to do it differently. So there's nothing wrong with emphasizing the positive, but there's more to it than that. By asking a student to walk me through the call, it helps me to fight the urge to tell them what they did wrong or what they did right. I don't need to tell them. I said, tell me what you said. What were you thinking when you walked up? What was your first thought process? Why did you do this? Tell me about that. Very open-ended questions, because what we want to know is what were they thinking. Their thought process is more important than what they did. And I'll say that again. The thought process they had is often much more important than their actions. Because I can see that they did the wrong thing, but I don't know, I can't see what was going on in their head and why they jumped to B when A was clearly more important. And unless I let them explain their thought process, I don't know where that came from, which means I'm not going to give feedback in a way that's likely to change that in the future. In other words, I can say, you did A, you should have done B. And what they're going to walk away from is, oh, I should always do the bleeding thing before the airway thing. Not the context, not the rationale, not the change in their thought process. What we need to do is get them thinking critically and thinking appropriately. So I need to know, why did you go to the bleeding issue before you went to the airway? And if their answer is that I saw that as an immediate life threat and I needed to manage it, that might be a very appropriate thought process that you can follow up on and say, yes, that's valid and that's appropriate. However, in this case, that was a very minimal amount of bleeding. And the bigger issue is your patient's not moving here and they're turning blue, and that should have taken priority. But then we're getting at the thought process and the rationale they use to get to their actions. That's way more powerful in terms of learning than just focusing on what they did, which is rather limited. If you prompt them with open-ended questions, let them explain things, let them get to that aha moment where they go, oh, I get it, I should have done that, now I know where I went wrong. They will remember that stuff. We all have that experience, that aha, oh my God, I just figured it out. That sticks. That sticks a whole lot more than an instructor telling them what they did right, what they did wrong.
Since recording that webinar for the Minnesota Ambulance Association, I've actually added a new tool to my debriefing approach in our classes. And I think this one works really well. There are a lot of different debriefing models out there. Lots to choose from, lots of formats, lots of ways of doing this. But the key is to make it simple and something your instructors can implement consistently. I like the Ffast guide here. It's provided by a group called Mobile Sim that provides a lot of free resources online. And I'll break this down kind of piece by piece. It doesn't contradict any of the things that I said earlier, but it's an interesting way to sort of review the case and put it in a context that accomplishes some of those self-reflection, some of those efforts to get students to recognize for themselves what could have been done differently, what could have been done better, what the critical thinking was behind the decisions that they made. So we start out with feelings, and basically it's just that, is how did that feel? It's amazing how often students in a scenario, especially if it's a testing situation or a high pressure situation, they may be angry, they may be frustrated, they may be depressed, they may be feeling emotional because this was a scenario that's incredibly close to something that they're familiar with in their personal life, an assault victim, and they've been an assault victim, who knows? So this is an opportunity not to spend a ton of time talking about feelings, but to take the time to get the emotional context out there, out of the way, get it out of the conversation before we move into sort of the meat of the decision-making kind of stuff. The next thing is the facts, and I love to do this on the board. I like to have a white erase or a dry erase board and a marker, and I tell people, what did you find? What was this scenario? What was it all about? And this is where we'll list all sorts of stuff. We'll do vital signs and complaints and the size of the patient and the location of the patient, whatever clues might be relevant for their efforts to understand what was going on with their patient. Then we moved into analysis, and this is where we can start breaking down. Ideally, you've got an idea ahead of time of what the specific objectives were for the scenario, so you know what the key issues are that you want to get at. And so asking in open-ended ways about questions, about interventions, about the interventions that were done, about the decisions that were made, the choices that were made throughout the scenario. And this is a great time, again, to ask open-ended questions. They talk about advocacy with inquiry, saying, okay, so I saw this, tell me about that. Was there another option there? What else might you have considered before doing this? Getting them to work their way down these various avenues of thought is very helpful. And then, as I said before, sometimes as an instructor, you have to insert some things that they don't arrive at themselves. You have to guide them to those correct conclusions and those correct decisions. As long as we're not doing that as the first point of contact, it's usually pretty effective. This can take a few minutes, but it can be very effective in terms of exploring sort of what an individual did as a team leader, what the group did, issues of group communication. All of those things can be explored using this tool. And then I always wrap up with the summary, and I sort of put these two categories. The summary and the take-home messages, to me, are sort of the same. I think the difference is the summary is what I share as an instructor. This is sort of the key issues, the objectives that they were supposed to learn, and make sure they understand what this scenario was supposed to teach and reinforce. And then the take-home messages is really for the group. Get several of people in the group or several messages from the group to say, okay, what did you learn? What are you going to remember? What's going to stick? What is going to change your treatment or your strategy in the future because of this learning lesson? And I think that format, in that simple little flow, really helps to give you some structure to do your debriefings in a consistent way after every scenario with every group. And if you use this format and you show this format to your students and everyone gets used to talking about the scenarios in this approach, everybody gets very comfortable with that and knows what's coming and knows how to participate, and it just makes it a more cohesive and consistent process.